All right, well, thank you. And thanks to all of you for joining me in my home here in Laramie. So I am joined by two completely worthless cats um, who cannot wait for me to go back to work so they can have the house back to themselves. So with that, I'd like to introduce myself. Obviously, I'm Hank Edwards. I run the Wildlife Health Laboratory in Laramie, Wyoming. We have a small laboratory within the Wyoming State Veterinary Laboratory, and we rely on them, along with our laboratory skills, to monitor wildlife disease across the state. So I've been doing this for about 20 years, and when I was asked to put this talk together, I really concentrated on some of the diseases that I thought you guys would find interesting, for one. Two, diseases that I thought that you're most likely to run into out in the field. So when I built this talk, I'm going to talk a lot about zoonotic diseases. Those are the first diseases I'm going to cover. So a zoonotic disease is a disease that'll go from animals to people. So there's probably half the diseases I'll talk about can go to people. But as I'm going through this talk, the last thing I want you to do is freak out, because some of these diseases are pretty scary, some of them are pretty serious. But think of this talk as a way to convey some information so you're aware of the diseases and you know some steps to take to keep yourself safe, as opposed to freaking out about the disease. So, like I said, these diseases have been around a long time. All of us have been living with them. So I'm here really just to build some awareness about the diseases that maybe we don't even think about on a day-to-day basis. So as I get going here, as Kristen said, I will stop a few times and ask questions. But if there's questions that either we don't address or you think of later, don't hesitate to log on to our website. We have a lot of wildlife disease information there, as well as a number to contact us. So if you can't find the answer to your question, don't hesitate to give us a call, and we'll do our best to answer those questions as we go. So any questions so far before I get going? Can everybody hear me okay? Is everything all right on your end? Good? All right, great. So here we go. So as I mentioned, we have the Wildlife Health Laboratory within the Wyoming State Vet Lab. There's 4 of us who work in that laboratory, and we spend the majority of our time in that lab, where we do a ton of diagnostics for chronic wasting disease and brucellosis, and we grow bacteria that cause respiratory disease in bighorn sheep, amongst a whole bunch of other things. We also work out in the field where we collect samples to monitor the health of animals that are, say, captured for a research project. And we also may go out in the field and necropsy an animal that was found dead and try and find the cause of death. Or we'll drag that animal back to our laboratory where we can do more in-depth diagnostics. In addition, we also have our research facility out in Seville Canyon, and that's where we do some research into animal diseases, where we try and gain a better understanding and hopefully maybe even develop some management tools down the road. So away we go. We're going to start with rabies. So rabies is a big disease, right? It's a major concern, particularly for human health. So believe it or not, 59,000, believe that, 59,000 people die of rabies a year. Now, all those deaths, almost all those deaths, are in countries that are developing countries, and they just don't vaccinate, and they don't have any good disease control strategies. That's not the way it is here in North America. We only have 1 or 2 people that get rabies a year, not the 59,000. But it gives you an appreciation for what a huge problem this disease really is. So rabies is caused by a virus, a lyssavirus. It's a neurotropic virus, which means that it likes to live in the nerves, spinal cord, central nervous system of its host, right? So it's transmitted by saliva. And it's also can be transmitted if you come in contact with brain or central nervous system tissue, like nerves and things like that, that may have the virus in them. Now, it takes more than just touching it, right? You need a break in the skin, like a bite, for the virus to penetrate. So once that virus penetrates the skin, it replicates in the muscle, and then it moves its way towards the nerves. And up the nerves it goes to the spinal cord, and eventually up into the brain. And that's where the problem begins, because it can cause fatal encephalitis. And then the virus, of course, enters the salivary gland, where it's able to reproduce and spread that disease to other animals. So there's a couple different forms of rabies. There's a furious form, which is, I'm sure, what everybody has in their mind of a rabid animal, right? It's wild and foaming at the mouth and real aggressive. But there's also the dumb version, where the animals are completely unaware of their surroundings. They can be drooling, have difficulty swallowing, very lethargic. So don't always think of an animal with rabies as being very aggressive and furious. With rabies, once the symptoms appear, unfortunately, this disease is 100% fatal. And that's why it's really important that if you get bit by an animal that you think may be rabid, that you take steps to seek some medical care, because time is of the essence. So you don't want to wait until the symptoms appear, right? That'd be exactly the wrong thing to do. So with rabies, abnormal behavior is normal. Now, obviously, this little skunk that's chasing this dog around does not have rabies. It's just looking for a friend. But it goes to show that skunks in particular can be really aggressive. So if you look at that picture of the skunk with the porcupine quills, that's what we find, that they will chase down other animals, animals that they'd normally be afraid of, and try and bite them. So that can be a horse, that can be a cow, that can be a human, it can be a dog, it can be whatever. They become very, very aggressive. So with bats, if you happen to see bats out during the day, something's not right. Now, that doesn't mean that every bat that's out during the day has rabies, but it should enter your mind that, hey, it's a possibility. And you should maybe not pick up that bat and maybe submit it for testing. That's a good way for us to monitor this disease, is if people like yourselves submit these animals for testing. So along those lines, you know, if any of you should ever wake up and you find a bat in your house, it is really important that you not do what you may think is the kind thing by opening up the front door and letting the bat free. Unfortunately, what needs to be done is you need to capture that bat and submit it for testing, because the problem is bats have very, very small teeth, and you may have been bitten in the night and not realize it. So it's really important anytime that you suspect that an animal could be rabid, that you submit that for testing, because once you submit it for testing, then you can seek medical care, and there's plenty of treatments out there that can stop you from getting the disease, but you've got to know if the animal was rabid first. So all mammals can get rabies. In Wyoming wildlife, we see skunks and bats as the primary carriers of rabies, but we certainly see it in domestics occasionally, cattle, horses, and cats and dogs. And a lot of those are when, of course, a skunk chases down a cow or a horse and bites them. And then, of course, a cat or even a dog can get a hold of a rabid bat. So for us to diagnose rabies, as I'm sure all of you are aware, we need to have the brain. So it's important when you're collecting an animal for rabies that you maintain that brain in the best shape you can, because we need to find a very specific part of the brain, and that's the cerebellum towards the back. And if that brain's smashed, it's really hard for us to find that particular structure. So it's hard for us to test mush, so please don't mush the brain on those animals that you think may have rabies. So on the right side of the screen, you'll see an FA there, and that's fluorescent antibody test. And what that does is that antibody lights up whenever it attaches to a rabies virus. So this is viewed under a special microscope, and that's the way we look for rabies, is actually looking for the presence of the virus in a brain smear. As far as the distribution of Wyoming, if you look up there in the upper right-hand corner, there is a map of Wyoming. And so far, or at least in 2019, I should say, They looked at 634 animals, found 1 positive fox, 1 positive raccoon, 10 positive skunks, and 12 positive bats. So you can see there's a lot of rabies in Wyoming. The map of the United States shows that bat rabies, that's the slanted lines, bat rabies occurs throughout the United States. Towards the center part of the states, it's more skunk, as opposed to the eastern part, which is more raccoon. And even down in Puerto Rico, they have skunks and mongooses. So there's quite a bit of rabies across the United States, and obviously quite a bit in Wyoming. So before I go on to plague, is there any questions so far?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
I can now.
Well, my name's Jonathan, and how do you turn in the animals for testing if you find them?
That is an excellent question. So there's a couple different ways to do it. Probably the best way to do it is submit an animal to your veterinarian, and they'll send it straight away to the Wyoming State Veterinary Laboratory. If it's wildlife you're concerned about, you can call the Wyoming Game and Fish, your local warden or biologist, and they can take care of that sample for you. And in some counties, public health will also take care of rabies samples and submit them to the vet lab for testing. Okay, good. So moving on to plague. Plague is a much different disease than rabies, right? This happens to be caused by a bacteria, but it's also a really, really serious disease. You probably associate plague with prairie dogs, and that's usually what we find in Wyoming, is it's the cause of prairie dog die-offs in several locations across the state. But it's important to remember that plague, it can be a problem in many species. It can affect many species, including deer, mountain lions, mice, just about any mammal, including people. So plague is called sylvatic plague, which means it's circulating in wild animals. It's transmitted primarily by fleas, but also by direct contact. So if you happen to pick up an animal that had plague, you could get it as well. It's called bubonic plague, and bubonic plague means that it infects the lymph nodes. And if you look at that picture in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that is actually a mountain lion, and you're looking at the mountain lion's jaw. So there are 2 very, very large lymph nodes on the outside of that jaw. Those are the mandibular nodes. And those are normally about the size, maybe of an almond. So you can see they're much and large, and that's because this lion had bubonic plague. You can also get the bacteria in the bloodstream. That's called septicemic. And then you can get pneumonic plague, which is the most serious. And that's when that disease gets into the lungs. So the important thing to remember about plague is that it is very treatable. All you got to do is get to a doctor and get on some antibiotics. It can be really a serious disease if you just kind of ignore it. So if you think that you've been exposed by, let's say you picked up a dead prairie dog that could have died of plague, and all of a sudden, within 2 or 3 days after picking that animal up, you start to maybe not feel so well. Maybe you're getting flu-like symptoms. That's when you need to get to the doctor. Get to the doctor and get on some antibiotics. The first thing, though, is don't pick up the prairie dog to begin with. It's an interesting story about plague in that it was brought to North America probably in the late 1890s. It probably was on one of the old steamships that happened to have a lot of rats with fleas that were carrying plague. So we know that plague got here sometime in the late 1890s, like I mentioned, and then that disease slowly moved west I think we identified it in Yellowstone National Park in 1930. And then that disease slowly moved a little bit farther east, and it kind of stopped right on our eastern border. If you look at Colorado, it kind of stopped on their eastern border. It did make it a little bit into Texas, as you can see, but for the most part, that seems to be the line that plague hasn't really crossed for the most part. So a lot of researchers speculate on why that is. We really don't know, but it probably has something to do with both the hosts and the fleas that transmit it. Every year, there's probably, I don't know, between 1 and 3 cases of plague in Wyoming a year where somebody will become infected. So it's out there. As far as I know, plague occurs across the entire state. So it's something to definitely be aware of. Tularemia. Tularemia is very similar to plague, right? This is another bacterial disease caused by the bacteria called Francisella tularensis. It is highly contagious and potentially fatal. This disease, though, tends to be spread by biting flies and ticks. And rather than being associated with prairie dogs like plague, this is associated with bunnies. So tularemia is frequently called rabbit fever. This disease, of course, like I mentioned, can be transmitted by flies and ticks, also by handling a sick animal, kind of like plague, but also airborne. So believe it or not, this disease is associated or a danger to a lot of lawn care workers because they accidentally will run over dead bunnies that could have died of tularemia. And of course, when they run over a dead bunny with a lawnmower, it vaporizes the bunny. And then, of course, that's when those bacteria can be breathed in and they can get tularemia. It can also be transmitted with contaminated food or water, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. One of the things about this disease is that if you happen to get bit by, say, a fly or a tick that's infected with tularemia, it forms these sores. So I don't know if you can see that picture of someone's leg with a sore on the ankle. That is actually from tularemia. So if you've been bitten and you see a sore or ulcer form like that, same story, right? Get to the doctor and get some antibiotics. Tularemia is another one that is very, very treatable, but you got to get to the doctor. Okay, so tularemia has 2 main forms. There is the terrestrial form that's mostly restricted to bunnies. So people come in contact with tularemia through hunting, right? Because they may harvest an animal that's got tularemia, and when they're feeding that animal, they can expose themselves. They can be bitten, like I mentioned, but more seriously is the pets, because a pet will go out and, let's say, just like that cat down the lower left, he finds a bunny that happens to have tularemia. Well, then the cat gets tularemia and the cat comes in the house. So the pet actually acts as almost like a vector, right? They're moving that disease from outside and they're bringing it inside. So if you have pets that like to go out and hunt, it's a really good idea to keep an eye on them. So if they start to look like they're sick, take them to the vet. Because if you let that go on, then that disease can be passed to you. So it's important to keep in mind. Tularemia has been around a very, very long time. It's something we've been living with for a long time, and we see some die-offs from it almost every year. So it's around, and you should be aware. It can also take an aquatic form where it circulates in the water. So it's more associated with beavers and muskrats. And people can become infected when they happen to drink or come in contact with some contaminated water. Now that is really rare, but it certainly can happen. So that's something to keep in mind. And if you happen to be playing in the stream and you see a dead beaver like up there in the upper left-hand corner, maybe it's time to find a different stream to play in and probably not touch the dead beaver. So tularemia, like I mentioned, occurs throughout the United States. It also occurs, quite honestly, throughout the world. It's a worldwide distribution. And every year we see somewhere between 2 and 4 cases of tularemia in the state. So certainly people get exposed either by bites or by handling infected animals. So before I go on, are there any questions to catch up on? Ooh, that's a really good question. So the answer is some. So dogs in particular can stand rabies. So dogs and I'm sorry, not rabies, I said that wrong, plague. So because they've kind of grown up eating these prairie dogs, for many, many generations, they've developed a resistance to plague. So I'm sure they feel bad for 3 or 4 days, but then they can get over it. Mountain lions, some can survive it, others cannot survive it. But most animals tend to be very susceptible to plague, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of animals that can survive infection, but there are a few. Maybe I said that wrong, but it actually showed up in the West Coast first, and it showed up in the California coast. I believe the first case was in San Francisco. I'm not positive about that, but I think so. You would see, it depends on how they were infected, but you would see an animal being very, very lethargic, didn't want to move very much. They could have some swollen areas if they happen to be bitten. But the main thing is they're just going to feel like, they're going to look like they feel bad, right? They're going to just lay around, which is going to be really hard to tell in a cat, isn't it? But they're just not going to have much energy. They're just going to look sick. You'll know a difference. If you're used to your pet, you will notice a difference. Oh, another great question. So, there's an old saying that you should not hunt rabbits until after the first frost. And the reason that saying came about is because you want to wait until the ticks and the flies are killed off for the winter. So there aren't any more rabbits being exposed to tularemia through ticks and flies. So the rabbits that are out there should be healthy. So here's one thing that you should remember. If you're ever field dressing a rabbit and you open it up and you see small white spots on the liver or the spleen, call up Game and Fish or your vet immediately. That is true with plague, and that's true with tularemia. If you ever see small white spots, and they'll be about the size of an end of a pin, then, and I mean a pin head, so quite small. If you ever see them, drop what you're doing, wash your hands, call your vet.
Great advice for those of us who like to rabbit hunt.
Yes.
Great, and I think that's all our questions for now.
Okay, let's move on. So we'll go to West Nile virus. So almost all of you should be aware of West Nile virus. You've heard of it. This, of course, is a viral disease called by a flavivirus. It is the leading cause of mosquito-borne disease in the United States. And of course, this disease is transmitted by mosquitoes who transfer the disease with a blood meal. In people that are infected with West Nile, they can get fever, meningitis, encephalitis, weakness, and even paralysis. So it can be a really serious disease. No vaccine or medicine is available for humans, but of course, there is a vaccine that's available for horses. So this is a disease that primarily circulates in the bird population, and the mosquitoes just simply pass that disease back and forth, right, between birds. And for the most part, when it stays in birds, it's really not that big of a deal, with some exceptions that I'll get to here in a minute. But when that disease spills out of those birds, it can infect incidental hosts, people, horses, deer. Lots of things can get West Nile, and some of those are very, very sensitive. Horses are one, and of course humans are as well. Although most humans are asymptomatic, it can be a very serious disease in the very young and as well as the old. The reason that we're concerned about West Nile virus is that it tends to cause pretty high mortality in corvids. So a corvid is a crow or a raven or a magpie. It's also a pretty significant cause of death in raptors like eagles and hawks, as well as sage grouse. So that's why we're concerned about it, and that's one reason we monitor it as it moves across the state. So some years we have pretty bad outbreaks, and other years, it's not so active. So we do keep an eye on this, particularly for the bird species that are sensitive to it. So we found West Nile virus across the entire state of Wyoming. And every year, this is from 2018, we see between 2 and 3 cases in people. In the early years when this disease was first coming through, which actually wasn't that long ago, we actually have had a total of 750 some odd cases in people. So this was a disease that was really significant when it hit us, and now it's kind of slowly tapered off and we don't see as many cases. So it's still a concern in the state, and it's a really good reason why you should be wearing mosquito repellent, right? Because West Nile virus can still be a very serious disease in people. So just keep that in mind, wear insect repellent. This is a really good reason. All right, so we're gonna move away from those scary diseases. Not that this one isn't so scary, but it's a little bit different. So we're gonna talk about Balis ascaris. Balis ascaris is an intestinal roundworm of raccoons, and it is really, really common. It's everywhere. So it doesn't happen very often. In fact, it's pretty rare. But when this disease goes to humans, it can be really, really damaging to people. So this is the way it works. So let's say a raccoon is infected with Balis ascaris, and he defecates somewhere in the soil, and those eggs are in the feces. Those eggs move to the soil. They're there for 2 to 4 weeks, where they become really infective. So once those eggs have sat in the soil a few weeks, then they're infective to other raccoons. They can also be infective to other hosts, including humans. So when a human accidentally ingests one of these eggs, it moves the intestine, the egg hatches, and that little larvae comes out. That's the problem, because the larvae are confused. They're used to being in raccoons. So when they're in a host that's not a raccoon, they try and find their way. And as they find their way, they migrate around the body. And as they migrate around the body, they can go through the eyes, they can go through the brain, and they can cause a tremendous amount of damage and even death, let alone blindness and some other irreversible effects. So that's why this worm is such a concern. It's really hard to get rid of the eggs. They need boiling water is about one of the few things that'll do them. Any kind of a strong heat will get rid of them. But standard disinfectants and standard chemicals don't touch them. They're really, really resistant. So I think the moral of this story is don't pick up the poop, right? Leave the poop be. If you do need to clean up after a bunch of raccoons, if you've had an area where they've been, wear gloves. Wear some latex gloves and wash your hands when you're done. Always good advice, right? It's not just raccoon poop we need to worry about. Lots of animals, not just wildlife, but lots of animals can have some pretty serious parasites in their fecal material. So if you have to move some poop, wear your gloves and wash your hands. It's really a good idea. But although I seem to have given poop a really bad name, I think that we need to remember that as far as we're concerned on the veterinary side of things, poop can be really helpful. We can tell a lot about an animal from its poop, right? We can tell what kind of nutrition, we can tell their diet, we can tell if they're stressed by measuring cortisol, we can determine DNA, genetics, and sex and species, we can look for parasites, we can do pregnancy. There's lots of things that poop is good for. So poop is handy, but we do wear gloves. All right, so before I move on to brucellosis, can I catch up on some questions? That's right. That's right. So you're right. You're not going to go eat the poop, but if you pick up a poop and then go eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, well, that's how you get the egg. Okay, any other questions, Kristen? Nope. Okay, so we'll move on to brucellosis. So many of you probably have heard about brucellosis. I don't know. It's a very interesting disease. And actually, this is what I've really spent most of my career working on, was brucellosis in the northwestern corner of the state. So this is a disease that was probably brought to Yellowstone, probably with the Spanish cattle as they moved through. We know that going back through some of our genetic tracebacks, that this was probably introduced right around the Civil War. There's probably been several introductions into Yellowstone National Park. But brucellosis is a huge disease. It used to be a big, big problem across the United States. It is a worldwide problem. In fact, 500,000 people a year are infected with brucellosis. Again, most of those are in developing countries, and it's a really, really serious disease. So the United States embarked in an eradication program in the 1930s, and they were successful in eradicating this disease from all of our cattle in 2009. This is a bacterial disease that tends to infect, at least in Wyoming, bison, elk, and cattle. It causes abortion where the mother will abort their calf in the third trimester of pregnancy. And that's how this disease is transmitted as other animals come in contact with that fetus or the fluids associated with that abortion. They can contract the disease, as well as the milk from the infected mother is also infectious, I should say. This is a disease that, of course, can be transmitted to humans, as I mentioned, but in the United States, it's rare. We don't see a lot of brucellosis going to humans anymore. So why is this such a big deal? Why should we care that much about brucellosis? It really doesn't affect our wildlife too much. They do lose a few calves, sure, but certainly not population limiting. And I say that there's two big reasons that this is a big concern. One is it's a human pathogen, and two is because it's a big deal for the livestock industry. Remember my story of the United States going through an eradication program to get rid of this bug. They were successful, right? They got it out of all the cattle except the elk and bison of the Yellowstone area. So if you are a cow rancher and you want to graze your cattle in South Dakota, let's say, and your South Dakota vet says, you know, we've spent the last 80 years trying to get rid of this disease. We really prefer if you didn't bring your cattle from Wyoming, nasty old Wyoming, into South Dakota, right? Because we don't want this disease. So that is the problem, is the country has spent so much time and so much money getting rid of this disease that it's hard if you're a cow rancher in Wyoming to get out of the state, right? So what we do as far as the Game and Fish Department is we do yearly surveillance. So every year we send our elk hunters a blood collection kit. That's over in the lower left-hand corner. And we ask them to please collect a little bit of blood from their harvested elk or bison. And if they could send that to the laboratory, then we'll test it for brucellosis and we'll see if they've had exposure. That actually is a really big deal because all the states that surround Wyoming are really interested in where the disease occurs and, more importantly, where it doesn't, because they need to know that if they're going to allow somebody to bring their cattle in to graze. So every year we survey a different part of the state and we cover the entire state every 5 years. So that map you see there in the lower left That is all the hunt areas, those are elk hunt areas, where we have found this disease either in elk or in bison. So you can see there's quite a number of areas in the Northwest. And I should mention the other thing that we do to try and prevent this disease to go into cattle is we do our best to separate elk and bison from cattle, particularly in the late winter and early spring when this disease tends to be very active. Any questions? Well, it's rare for it to kill people. It's one of those diseases that infects the joints. So people tend to be not, it doesn't tend to kill them, but it causes crippling reactions. So they have terrible arthritis. They can't move their fingers, can't move their hands. It's really debilitating disease. So I think it's just, that's what makes it so serious. There are types of brucella. Brucella melitensis is one that does cause fatalities in people, but that disease does not occur here in America. Yeah, right, right. Um, the difference is that we don't have a lot of deer that overlap with our infected elk populations during that time of year, right? Because deer are going to get it, or another animal is going to get it during that late winter, early spring, when elk and deer tend to be separate, at least up in that northwest corner. So the answer is we believe it will go to deer, but we don't see it in those species. And the same is true for pronghorn. We don't see this disease. Okay, let's move on to lead poisoning, which isn't really a disease, right? It's more of a poisoning. So remember, lead is a very highly toxic metal, and animals are exposed when they eat the lead. It's not so much a stray shot where maybe a bird gets a pellet with a shotgun. It's not that that eventually kills them from lead poisoning. It's actually that they eat it. And when they eat it, it goes into the gizzard. The gizzard has that grinding action, and then it goes through the gastric stomach and it dissolves the lead where it eventually ends up in the bloodstream. And that's what causes lead poisoning. So lead is, like I said, very, very toxic, and it doesn't take very much lead to kill an eagle. I think it's been said that a 150 grain lead bullet will kill the equivalent of about 10 eagles. That's how toxic it is. It's very, very toxic. This is a disease that when an animal starts to become affected by it, it can be treated, but you've got to get there really early in the course of the poisoning. And usually the damage is really irreversible. So remember that animals can come in contact several different ways, right? If it's waterfowl, they can ingest lead fishing gear, like that picture in the lower right-hand corner, or like the duck that's in the upper left-hand corner. You can see that animal's ingested a bunch of lead BBs. And they do that when they're foraging in the bottom of a lake. So that's one of the reasons that we no longer allow lead to be used in waterfowl hunting, and it's no longer allowed in shotgun loads that's used for waterfowl. And that's the reason it's very, very toxic. Another way that animals can be exposed, particularly eagles, is one, if they were to scavenge, say, that duck that was in the upper corner there, they can then become infected with lead. Another way, of course, is if they were to consume some leftover carcass parts after a hunter had field dressed his deer, and there were some bullet shards still remaining in some of that meat, and that eagle accidentally ingested it. So here's a radiograph of, in the upper left-hand corner, of the amount of shrapnel that can happen in the meat. So it's, that lead goes a lot farther than the original entrance room of that entrance wound of that bullet. So those fragments are the ones that can be picked up of course, the birds. Here's another picture in the lower corner of a waterfowl that's consumed some fishing gear. And then, of course, the gizzard that you see there that's opened up, that's got the lead pellet. So here's a video of an eagle that's affected by lead poisoning. And you really see a lot of effects from lead in the central nervous system, around the brain. You get high concentrations in the blood, the liver, the kidneys. The animals are very uncoordinated. They can be blind, labored respirations. They have strange vocalizations. You can see diarrhea, droopy wings. The animals are just flat out depressed. So this is a really serious disease, and I'm amazed how much we see of it each year. I think it's good to keep in mind too that everything, not everything, but just about everything is susceptible to lead poisoning, right? Including people. So keep that in your mind, that lead is really a very, very toxic element, and you really do need to be careful around it because it can have some long-lasting effects. Any questions before I go to canine distemper? Yes, that is another good question. You guys are full of them. So copper bullets are just on the market, and from what I understand, they are very, very effective. And then, of course, there are steel substitutes to most hunting gear, as well as some other elements out there that are not toxic. So yes, they're out there. It's a little bit harder to find lead substitutes in a lot of the fishing gear, but I believe a lot of those do exist. Okay, so move on to canine distemper. This is a disease that is very widespread, and I'm sure that all of you at home who have dogs, those dogs are vaccinated against this disease. It can be really, really serious, and animals that are infected, we see somewhere between a 50 and 100% mortality rate. So this can be a nasty, nasty virus. So it's a virus that causes respiratory disease as well as gastrointestinal and even some nervous system disorders you can see with it. It's very contagious. It's transmitted primarily through fluids, but also airborne. It tends to infect dogs, so that can be our canines, so that can be coyotes, wolves, and foxes, as well as domestic dogs, right? Raccoons, skunks, and black-footed ferrets, particularly black-footed ferrets. This can be a very, very nasty virus. Unfortunately, there's no cure, but like I mentioned, there is a vaccine that's available for your dogs. So the signs for distemper are very, very similar to signs for the dumb form of rabies, like I mentioned earlier. You can see some nasal and eye discharge that you don't see with rabies, but they tend to be very, very lethargic, uncoordinated, like these poor raccoons here that are infected with rabies. You can see some coughing and some vomiting, again, because of the gastrointestinal effect, as well as some muscle twitches and some seizures. So this can be a pretty serious disease, really. And seems like we see it every year in a few species. Moving on to bighorn sheep respiratory disease. This is another disease that I've spent a lot of my career studying, really. This is a disease that occurs almost in all of our herds. We have a few herds where we don't have some of the nasty bugs cause. What happens is when a bug, like a bacteria that's really, really pathogenic, once that gets introduced into a herd like this, what happens is it can cause a pretty large scale die-off. We'll see a bunch of adults die, we'll see lambs die, and we'll see yearlings die. But those animals that survive, those bugs continue to live in those animals, and they continue to persist. And although the adults may not die from them, what happens is when they have lambs, they pass those pathogens on to the lambs, and because the lambs are weak, they don't survive. So we certainly have our Whiskey Basin herd and other herds where that is the problem. We just can't bring enough lambs to get them to make it into the next year. So our lamb recruitment is very low because most of them are dying of respiratory disease, like you see in that video in the upper corner. So there's been a lot of documented disease die-offs across the West. Over 14,000 bighorn sheep have died due to some of these bugs. It's really hard, and it's really hard to combat and try and find ways to manage around this disease, particularly in some of our herds, like I mentioned, where we just can't get any lambs to survive. So it's a hard thing to do when you essentially just sit around and watch a herd dwindle and you hope that something changes. So this is like I mentioned, this is a disease that we spend a lot of time and a lot of resources in monitoring around the state. So if you look at that map, that's just simply a map of every one of our bighorn sheep herds and what bugs are in them. You don't need to pay attention to all the pie charts. Just be aware that we continually monitor our bighorn sheep populations and the bugs they carry. There's two reasons we do that. One is we want to monitor if a new pathogen should come in. So if we see a lot of die-off, we can trace that back. And two, if we have a herd that's starting to die off without an introduction of a new bug, we want to know why that is. Is that because it's a harsh winter and these bugs have kind of gotten a stronger foothold? They're able to cause disease. So this is something we continue to research. We spend a lot of time on this. So before I go to white nose, any questions to catch up on? Ooh, I don't know if it's an introduced disease or not. I don't know where distemper came from. Big cats get distemper, so lions and tigers. House cats do not get the canine distemper virus. They have their own virus, but it's not this canine distemper that circulates around. I don't know about bears and distemper. I don't believe so in my reading, but I don't know that for sure. I guess I'd be surprised if bears got distemper. Yes, yes, and that's the mortality rate of black-footed ferrets. In fact, all mustelids with canine distemper is nearly 100%. Bleak. There are some vaccines out there for domestic sheep that prevents them from getting a lot of these respiratory diseases. Those vaccines have differing effectiveness, but a lot of these diseases farmers are able to manage around. So we don't see big die-offs in some of the big domestic sheep flocks like we do with some of our bighorn sheep. And two, bighorn sheep tend to be really, really sensitive to some of these bugs, where domestic sheep are less sensitive. They're less affected by them compared to our bighorn sheep. Okay, move on to white nose syndrome. This is something I bet most of you have heard about. This is a disease that made it to the East Coast, I think in 2006, and has slowly spread west. So it's a big deal because it kills a lot of bats, and bats are really important, right, in the ecology. They eat lots of bugs and they can be pollinators. They do a lot of very, very beneficial things. Even though I was giving them a hard time with rabies, they're still a very, very important thing. So this is important to us. So what happens is this fungus, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce, happens to live in the caves and the mines where the bats tend to hibernate. And what happens is when these bats come into the cave, they get infected, and this fungus starts to grow on their nose, on their ears, and on their wings. You can see it on that wing photograph down there. So what happens is the bat spends a tremendous amount of effort and energy fighting this disease, and it causes some imbalances. It makes it really hard on the bats, and they tend to have a shortened hibernation. And what happens is they essentially starve to death from this bacteria, or I'm sorry, this fungus. So this is a big deal, particularly in the east. Like I mentioned, we're just starting to see it in Wyoming. We discovered it in Fort Laramie in 2018. And you can see, for the most part, we're just about the farthest west extension, but there has been some identified up in Washington. So this is a disease we're continuing to monitor in the state, and we're monitoring many of our bat populations as they come out of hibernation here in the next, probably in the next few weeks, if not months. A similar problem is called chytrid. Chytrid is a fungal disease that happens to infect amphibians. So this is not the same fungus that infects the bats, but it's similar. So this too can lead to pretty large die-offs in many of our amphibian populations, and it causes the skin to slough off and die, like this picture down here in the lower right-hand corner. So what happens is these amphibians get infected through the water, and once this fungus enters the skin, it grows, and it eventually will kill the amphibian in about 2 or 3 weeks. And then once it kills the amphibian, then that fungus completes its life cycle, and it's released back into the water where it can infect other amphibians that happen to be swimming by. So again, this is a fungus that infects the outer skin layer. It tends to infect the thicker, less permeable skin like the back, causes electrolyte balances, loss of muscle control, and those animals will eventually die. You can tell affected animals, they have reddened or sloughed skin, and it tends to be a pretty serious disease in many of our amphibian populations. So I've got a map of that here, and you can see that we've found chytrid in almost all of our populations. So you can see that lower map there. The yellow is where they've been identified. The gray is where we have yet to identify them. So there's quite a bit of chytrid out there, and it's something that we keep an eye on. So before I go to the next disease, any questions to get caught up on? Okay. Move on to chronic wasting disease. So if you guys have not heard of this disease, it's something you likely will. It's very in the news right now, and probably will be for the months to come. This is a disease that we discovered in the southeastern corner of the state in about the 1970s, 1980s, and we've seen this disease move across the entire state now, or just about the entire state. So this disease is much different than maybe some of the other diseases we've talked about. This is a progressive fatal disease of the nervous system of cervids. So a cervid is a white-tailed deer, a mule deer, elk, reindeer, moose. They're all susceptible to this disease. So it's called a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. So what that means is transmissible. It can go from animal to animal. Spongiform means sponge-like change, like in that picture of down in the bottom right-hand corner. That's a sponge-like change of the brain. And then encephalopathy means it affects the brain. Causative agent is a prion, which is a lot different than the bacteria and the viruses that we've been talking about with all the other diseases, right? So what makes this so kind of weird is that this prion is just a different shape of normal cellular prion. So we all mammals have this prion protein in our cells, and it tends to occur mostly in and around the central nervous system, particularly the brain. So what happens is as this abnormal prion comes in contact with normal cellular prion, it forces that normal cellular prion to change its shape. Once it changes its shape, that protein can no longer perform what it's supposed to be doing for the cell. So the cell gets rid of it, right? Because it's no use to it, it's not working. The cell gets rid of it, but because that prion has changed shape, the body can no longer get rid of it. It's like it's really, really resistant to the normal enzymes the body would use to digest it. So what happens is these proteins build up and they build up and they build up and they build up. And as they build up, they start killing the cells of the central nervous system. They kill the cells in the brain. And that's what causes the disease to happen. So as animals reach the end stages of the disease, now keep in mind that animals can be infected and test positive for a year, sometimes 2 years or longer, but they don't show the signs, what you think of chronic wasting disease or what I'm going to describe here, until probably the last 4 to 8 weeks maybe. And during those last 4 to 8 weeks, animals really lose a ton of weight. They drool a lot, they have droopy ears, completely unaware of their surroundings. So the saying is, the lights are on, but no one's home. And that is truly how they look. They truly have a very blank look in their face or in their eyes, and very, very, very thin. So this disease is transmitted 2 ways, animal to animal, as well as through the environment. So we know that animals that are infected with CWD will shed prions in their feces and urine and saliva. And as those accumulate in the environment, they can serve as a way to infect other animals. So it's almost like a reservoir. And we know that carcasses can serve as a way to transmit this disease as well. So the scary part about this disease is these prions, not only are they difficult for the body to get rid of, like I said, but they're really resistant in the environment. And we know that, at least with other prion diseases, they can remain infective in the environment for 16 years or even longer. So we don't know if CWD lasts quite that long yet, but from what we've seen so far, we know that CWD lasts a long, long time. We just don't know exactly how long. Probably 16 years or longer though, right? So anyway, animals can become infected when they come in contact with some of these prions in the environment, whether that's coming in contact with forage or fences, feeders, troughs, mineral licks, carcasses, whatever. That can serve as a source of infection for these animals. So that makes this disease really hard to deal with. This is really going to be a challenge for us to manage this disease. So like I said, it was initially discovered in the southeastern corner of the state and has since spread almost across the entire state. But it's not just a problem in Wyoming, as you can see in that lower map. It occurs in 26 of our 50 states, as well as Canada. It's found in Norway and Finland, South Korea, and Sweden. So this is a worldwide problem. It's not just our problem, it's a worldwide problem. And it's a big worry because we know that this disease, at least from what we've seen so far, every animal that gets it is going to die within about 2.5 years. Some live longer, some live less, but generally about 2.5 years. In some hunt areas, up to half of the deer can have CWD, and that's really worrisome when you know that half of those deer are going to die. What does that mean for the long-term health of our deer populations if we're going to have that many that die? Right now, we don't know how to stop the disease. We're looking into ways that maybe we could manage it, but we don't know how to stop it. And another problem is the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, have recommended that CWD positive animals not be consumed. So that's a big worry for a hunter, right? Who happens to harvest an animal that looked really good but tested positive. What's he to do now, or she? Now that she's harvested this animal and it tests positive and the CDC recommends that it not be consumed, that's a hard thing when people depend on some of this deer meat to make them through the winter. Okay, so before I go on to hemorrhagic disease, and I'm almost done, I've only got a few more diseases to get through. Are there any questions to catch up on? Cool. Good. There are a lot of other prion diseases. In fact, many species have their own prion disease. And that's the funny thing about prion diseases. They tend to be very, very species specific. So humans have their own. It's called Kuru. Jacob disease is another one. And actually, there's probably half a dozen different prion diseases that humans have. Sheep, of course, have scrapie. Mink have their own prion disease, and I believe cats do too. Of course, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE, in the UK. So there's lots and lots out there. Interestingly enough, some species, in fact, many species don't have one. Dogs would be an example of species that, to my knowledge, do not have a prion disease. Yes, they can be destroyed with heat, but it takes intense heat. So I think it's 1,500 degrees is what most biological incinerators run at. So there needs to be 1,500 degrees, I believe, for 30 seconds. So that is really, really intense heat, probably more than you would experience through, say, a grass fire or something like that, if that's what you're thinking about, moving through destroying prions in the environment. It probably takes a higher heat for more time than a typical fire would do. But yes, heat will do it, and strong chemicals will do it. So 40% bleach is effective at neutralizing it. And there's some other strong chemicals that'll work. But most disinfectants and common soaps have no effect on the prion. Ooh, that is a really good question, and I don't know that people know the answer to that. They're looking into what makes their CWD so much different, because it's much different than what we see here in the United States. So I don't know that that answer has been determined yet. It may very well be that it was a spontaneous mutation, or maybe it was an introduction. I really don't know that they've determined that yet. Okay, let's move on to hemorrhagic diseases. I'm sure most of you have heard of these. This is blue tongue and EHD, and it's something that we see move through our state every 7 to 10 years. So this too is a viral disease, like I mentioned, and this virus causes hemorrhaging, so it makes the blood vessels leak blood. We can see some really large outbreaks to where we see a lot of animals die of this disease. This is true, particularly in our Black Hills and our white-tailed deer populations, as well as other areas around Sheridan and other scattered areas around the state. Unfortunately, there's no treatment for this. We just are prepared when it happens because, like I said, you can predict it every 7 to 10 years. So like I said, there's 2 viruses that can cause this. There's EHD, or epizootic hemorrhagic disease virus, and as well as the blue tongue virus. Both of these viruses cause very similar diseases. They're both transmitted by culicoides, or those little biting midges or no-see-ums. But it's vector transmission only. In other words, deer don't give it to another deer. It's very acute, so animals that are infected have increased body temperature or fever, swollen tongue and neck, and no fear of humans and being very, very weak, like that deer in the lower left. Chronic, if an animal does survive this disease, because it tends to destroy a lot of the vessels, there can be a lot of problems that these animals have to get through, like hoof deformities, you can have antler deformities. There can be a lot of lasting problems with this disease in those deer or elk that survive. So for the most part, this disease has been documented in deer, elk, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, and bison, mountain goats. But in Wyoming, we really see it primarily in white-tailed deer as well as pronghorn. Once in a while, it will get some of those other species, but it's not common. Like once in a while, we'll see it in mule deer, but for the most part, it's white-tailed deer and it's pronghorn. It's distributed across the entire United States, and particularly in the southeastern corner of the United States, they can see tremendous death loss due to this virus. And this is a virus that's constantly tracked by many, many agencies because it has such big implications. And this is my very, very last slide. So congratulations to all of you for making it this far. Papillomas, this is something that we get a lot of calls on from different members of the public. So papilloma is simply, or very similar to a wart on humans. It's the same virus. And it's the same thing, actually, that these are just essentially like a wart. And these are usually benign and they're temporary. So the animals will get over them and they'll clear up and they'll be just fine. But it tends to infect the young and it tends to affect the face and around the front of the animal. So when you see them, I know they look pretty bad, particularly that picture of the deer, and that probably is affecting them. That's a pretty severe case. Normally, they're not nearly that bad. There's just a few of them on the body. So the animals get over them, they're just fine. One interesting thing about papillomas, though, if you look at that picture of the bunny, several people have speculated that's probably where the myth of the jackalope came from, that it was probably a bunny with papillomavirus giving that appearance of horns, and it probably just has slowly grown out from there. All right, so that is all I have. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
So what happens if someone eats one of those?
That is a good question. So far, there's been no indication that this disease, as in chronic wasting disease, will go to people. There's been a fair amount of research that's been done so far, and to date, there's no indication it goes to people. That said, just like the CDC, they're playing it safe. Because of BSE, if you know about BSE in the UK, that is a prion disease in cattle that did go to a few people. So because of BSE, they fear that CWD could do the same thing. So that's why they recommend that you not consume it.
Good. She's still muted, but they're asking questions.
That's a good question. And I would say that I certainly did not have my mind made up that I was going to work with wildlife disease when I was in high school. In fact, it was the opposite. When I graduated from high school, I made up my mind I was never going to go to college. Well, after driving tractor for about a year, I quickly changed my mind and decided that maybe college wouldn't be so bad. Well, I come from a long line of veterinarians. My brother's a vet, my father's a vet, my sister-in-law's a vet. And I decided early on, just like my decision out of high school, that I was not going to become a veterinarian. And that actually I held true to. I did not become a veterinarian, but I soon worked at the Wyoming State Veterinary Laboratory. And during my tenure in the vet lab, I got exposed to a lot of diseases and a lot of work with pathology and parasitology and bacteriology and all those sciences that determine diseases. And I really got interested. It really caught my attention. And I changed my major to molecular biology. And then from there, I got a master's degree in wildlife pathology or pathobiology from the University of Wyoming. I worked for the Wyoming State Veterinary Laboratory in their necropsy lab until the job in Game and Fish came open. And then in, I think, 1997, I moved to the Game and Fish department. I do have a great job. Sometimes it can be a little stinky, right? Because everything that I work with, unfortunately, not everything, but a lot of things that we work with have died and have been out in the field for a long time. So sometimes my cats are really interested when I come home because I smell really cool. But for the most part, yes, I have really enjoyed my job. It has really been a lot of fun. Yes, yes, I like your grandfather very much. He's a great state vet. Yes, good question. So you can type in Wyoming wildlife disease. That'll take you to our website where we have a ton of information on wildlife disease. Many of the diseases I've talked about, you can find more information there, and you can find links to dig into more information, particularly with CWD. Again, like I said in the start of this video, if you get to the bottom of those pages and you still have questions, our phone number is listed there, so do not hesitate to call. Like I said, there's 4 of us in the lab, and we'll do our best to answer your question. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for listening. I appreciate it.